Captain Sarah Mitchell had seen 3 tours of duty in Iraq, but nothing prepared her for the assignment that would change everything. The 8-year-old Army medic from small-town Ohio had volunteered for one final mission before her scheduled return home to her husband and 2 young children. The morning of November 15, 2004, started like any other in the war-torn city of Fallujah. The sun rose over concrete barriers and razor wire, casting long shadows across the compound where Sarah's medical unit prepared for what seemed like a routine supply run to forward operating Base Liberty. Intelligence reports suggested the route was relatively secure, with minimal insurgent activity in the past week. Sarah checked her medical supplies one final time, ensuring her field kit contained everything needed for emergency treatment. Her fellow soldiers joked nervously about the mission, a common way to deal with the constant tension that came with operating in one of Iraq's most dangerous cities. Private Johnson, barely 20 years old, complained about the heat already building despite the early hour. Sergeant Rodriguez, a veteran of 2 previous deployments, reminded everyone to stay alert and follow protocol. The convoy consisted of 3 heavily armored Humvees carrying medical supplies, food rations, and ammunition to the forward base. Sarah rode in the middle vehicle alongside 4 other soldiers, her medical bag secured between her feet. The route would take them through several checkpoints and past areas where improvised explosive devices had been discovered in recent weeks. As they left the relative safety of the main base, Sarah gazed out at the scarred landscape of Fallujah. Buildings showed the damage from months of fighting, with bullet holes marking concrete walls and debris scattered across empty lots. Children occasionally appeared in doorways or behind broken windows, their curious eyes following the American vehicles as they rumbled past. The first 2 checkpoints passed without incident. Radio chatter remained routine, with updates on traffic conditions and weather reports. Sarah found herself thinking about home, about the letter she had written to her daughter's kindergarten class, describing her work as a combat medic. She had promised them she would return safely to tell them stories about helping people in a faraway land. 20 minutes into the journey, the lead vehicle's commander reported suspicious activity ahead. A group of military-age males had been observed near an overpass, and debris was scattered across the road in a pattern that suggested possible roadside bombs. The convoy slowed as soldiers scanned the surrounding buildings and rooftops for signs of an ambush. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with potential combat situations. She mentally reviewed her training for treating casualties under fire, checking the location of her trauma supplies and ensuring her weapon was ready if needed. The radio crackled with terse communications between the convoy vehicles and their base operations center. The decision came to proceed with caution, taking an alternate route that would add 15 minutes to their journey, but avoid the suspicious area entirely. As they turned down a narrow street, lined with abandoned shops and residential buildings, Sarah noticed how quiet everything seemed. No civilians were visible, no children playing in the dusty yards, no shopkeepers standing in doorways. Sergeant Rodriguez voiced what everyone was thinking through the vehicle's internal communication system. The absence of normal civilian activity often indicated that locals had received warnings to stay indoors, a sign that insurgents might be planning an attack. The convoy increased speed, hoping to clear the area quickly. The explosion came without warning. A massive roadside bomb, buried beneath the asphalt and triggered remotely, detonated directly under Sarah's vehicle. The blast lifted the 7-ton Humvee into the air, spinning it completely around before slamming it down on its side. The armored windows shattered, filling the air with glass fragments and choking dust. In the seconds following the explosion, as Sarah's consciousness flickered in and out, she could hear the distant sound of automatic weapons fire. The convoy had driven directly into a carefully planned ambush. Insurgents positioned in surrounding buildings opened fire with rifles and rocket-propelled grenades, targeting the remaining vehicles and any survivors of the initial blast. Sarah's training kicked in despite her injuries. She attempted to assess her condition and that of her fellow soldiers, but found moving extremely difficult. Blood was running down her face from multiple shrapnel wounds, and she could feel the warm wetness spreading across her uniform from injuries she couldn't yet identify. The metallic taste of blood filled her mouth, and her vision blurred from what she suspected was a concussion. The sound of gunfire intensified as the surviving members of the convoy attempted to establish defensive positions. Radio calls for immediate medical evacuation and reinforcements filled the airways, but Sarah's vehicle's communication equipment had been destroyed in the blast. She was trapped in the overturned Humvee with her unconscious teammates, unable to help them or call for assistance. Minutes felt like hours as the firefight continued around them. Sarah could hear boots running past their position, and the distinctive sound of insurgent weapons mixed with the familiar reports of American rifles. Explosions from grenades and mortars shook the ground, covering the wrecked vehicle with additional debris. Through a crack in the damaged armor plating, Sarah caught glimpses of the battle raging outside. She saw insurgent fighters moving between buildings, their faces covered with cloth masks, carrying weapons she recognized from intelligence briefings. The remaining convoy vehicles had taken positions at either end of the kill zone, but they were heavily outnumbered and taking casualties. As darkness began to fall, the intensity of the fighting decreased, but never completely stopped. Sarah realized that rescue would not come quickly, if at all. The area was now under insurgent control, and any rescue attempt would require a major military operation. She would have to survive on her own, using her medical training to treat her wounds and those of her unconscious companions. The first night was the longest of Sarah's life. She worked by feel in the darkness, using supplies from her damaged medical kit to stop bleeding and stabilize injuries. 2 of her fellow soldiers showed no signs of life, while the other 2 remained unconscious but breathing. The sounds of the city at night filtered through the wreckage. Distant gunfire, dogs barking, and occasionally, voices speaking in Arabic. By dawn, Sarah had counted at least 7 separate bullet wounds in her body, along with numerous shrapnel injuries from the roadside bomb. She had lost significant blood and was experiencing symptoms of severe dehydration. Her left arm was likely broken, and she suspected internal injuries based on the pain in her abdomen and the difficulty breathing that suggested possible rib fractures. The insurgents had not discovered their location during the night, but Sarah knew it was only a matter of time. The overturned vehicle was partially concealed by debris and the wall of a damaged building, but it would not hide them indefinitely. She began planning for the possibility of capture, destroying sensitive documents, and preparing to implement the survival training all soldiers received before deployment. As the sun rose over Fallujah on the second day, Sarah Mitchell faced the most challenging test of her life. Alone, severely wounded, and trapped behind enemy lines, she would need every ounce of her medical knowledge, military training, and personal determination to survive what was to come. The second day brought new challenges that tested every survival skill Sarah had learned during her military career. As morning light filtered through the twisted metal of the destroyed Humvee, she could hear voices approaching their position. Arabic speakers were conducting what appeared to be a systematic search of the area, checking buildings and debris for survivors or valuable equipment. Sarah forced herself to remain completely still, despite the excruciating pain from her multiple gunshot wounds. She had used strips of cloth from her uniform to create pressure bandages, but several wounds continued to seep blood. Her medical training told her she was experiencing early stages of shock, with symptoms including rapid heartbeat, shallow breathing, and periods of confusion. The voices grew closer, accompanied by the sound of debris being moved and metal being struck with tools. Sarah realized the insurgents were not just looking for survivors but were also searching for weapons, ammunition, and communication equipment. The destroyed convoy represented a significant prize, and they would be thorough in their examination of each vehicle. Through a gap in the wreckage, Sarah watched as armed figures approached the overturned Humvee. She held her breath as they examined the exterior damage, noting the effectiveness of their roadside bomb and discussing the possibility of survivors in rapid Arabic. One fighter climbed onto the vehicle's exposed undercarriage, peering through broken windows and damaged hatches. For reasons Sarah would never understand, the searchers concluded the vehicle was empty and moved on to other targets. Perhaps the interior was too dark to see clearly, or the extensive damage convinced them no one could have survived. Whatever the reason, their failure to discover the trapped Americans bought Sarah precious time. Once the voices faded into the distance, Sarah began a careful assessment of her situation. Of her 4 companions, 2 had died from their injuries during the night. The remaining 2 soldiers were alive but unconscious, with severe head trauma that left them unresponsive. Sarah was effectively alone, responsible not only for her own survival, but for protecting her unconscious teammates. Water became her most immediate concern. The vehicle's emergency water supply had been contaminated by hydraulic fluid and debris, leaving Sarah with only the small amount in her personal canteen. In the intense heat of the Iraqi desert, dehydration would kill her faster than her bullet wounds if she couldn't find a clean water source. Using her uninjured arm, Sarah began carefully exploring the wreckage for anything useful. She found several energy bars that had been scattered by the explosion, along with a partially functional radio that received signals but could not transmit. Through the damaged receiver, she listened to American forces coordinating search and rescue operations, but they were focusing on areas several miles from her actual location. The radio traffic revealed that the ambush had been part of a larger insurgent offensive throughout Fallujah. Multiple American units were engaged in heavy fighting, and resources for search and rescue were stretched thin. Sarah realized that immediate rescue was unlikely, and she would need to survive for several more days at minimum. Pain management became another critical challenge. Her medical supplies included limited pain medication, but she needed to remain alert and functional. Sarah made the difficult decision to use minimal painkillers, saving the stronger medications for potential emergency surgery if her condition deteriorated further. The constant pain from her injuries was overwhelming, but it also helped keep her conscious and focused. As the day progressed, Sarah observed increased insurgent activity in the surrounding area. Fighters moved through the neighborhood in small groups, establishing defensive positions and preparing for what appeared to be an extended battle with approaching American forces. She could hear the distant sound of helicopters and artillery, indicating that her fellow soldiers were fighting to reach the ambush site. The afternoon brought a new crisis, when one of her unconscious companions began showing signs of severe internal bleeding. Sarah had limited medical supplies and no surgical instruments, but she attempted to stabilize the soldier using field medicine techniques. Working in the cramped, dark interior of the overturned vehicle, with her own injuries limiting her mobility, she fought to save a life under impossible conditions. Despite her efforts, the soldier died as the sun was setting on the second day. Sarah was now alone with one remaining unconscious companion, facing another night in enemy territory. The psychological impact of losing another teammate was almost as devastating as her physical injuries. She began talking to her unconscious companion, partly to maintain her own sanity, and partly hoping that familiar voices might help him regain consciousness. The second night was marked by intense combat, as American forces pushed deeper into the neighborhood. Sarah could hear the distinctive sounds of different weapon systems, from small arms fire to the heavy thump of mortar rounds. Explosions lit up the night sky, and the smell of smoke and cordite filled the air inside the wrecked vehicle. Around midnight, Sarah heard American voices for the first time since the ambush. A patrol had entered the immediate area, moving carefully through the debris-filled streets. She desperately wanted to call out for help, but she could also hear insurgent fighters nearby, and revealing her location might endanger both herself and the rescue patrol. The Americans moved past their position without detecting the hidden Humvee. Sarah listened to their radio communications fade into the distance, knowing she had missed what might be her only chance for immediate rescue. The decision to remain hidden was tactically correct, but emotionally devastating. She spent the rest of the night questioning whether she had made the right choice. Dawn of the third day brought both hope and despair. Sarah's remaining companion had died during the night, leaving her completely alone among the bodies of her fellow soldiers. Her own condition had deteriorated significantly, with signs of infection setting in around several wounds, and her strength ebbing from blood loss and dehydration. The sound of helicopters grew stronger as morning progressed, indicating that American forces were mounting a major operation to secure the area. Sarah could hear the distinctive rotor noise of Blackhawks and the heavier sound of Chinook transport helicopters. Ground forces were clearly being reinforced for a major push into the neighborhood. Through her damaged radio, Sarah learned that Special Operations Forces had been assigned to locate and recover the missing convoy personnel. Navy SEALs and Army Rangers were conducting detailed searches of every building and potential hiding place in the ambush area. The military was not abandoning its personnel, even in the face of intense enemy resistance. Sarah began preparing for what she hoped would be her rescue. She organized the identification tags of her fallen companions, gathered important intelligence materials that had survived the blast, and attempted to make herself as visible as possible to friendly forces while remaining hidden from insurgents who continued to move through the area. The waiting was the hardest part. Every sound could indicate rescue or capture. Every shadow might hide a friendly face or an enemy fighter. Sarah's medical training helped her understand that her body was beginning to shut down from trauma and blood loss. But her military discipline and thoughts of her family kept her focused on survival. As explosions and gunfire intensified around their position, Sarah prepared for what would be either her rescue or her final battle. The SEALs were coming, and after 2 days in hell, Captain Sarah Mitchell was ready to go home. The sound that would forever remain etched in Sarah Mitchell's memory was not the explosion that destroyed her convoy or the gunfire that followed. It was the steady rhythm of tactical boots moving through debris, accompanied by the quiet hand signals and whispered communications of the Navy SEALs who had spent 2 days fighting their way to her location. Petty Officer First Class Marcus Rodriguez had been leading SEAL Team 7 through the most dangerous neighborhoods of Fallujah for 18 hours straight. His team had been specifically tasked with locating survivors from the ambushed medical convoy, and they refused to abandon the mission despite mounting casualties and dwindling ammunition supplies. Rodriguez and his 5-man team had already cleared dozens of buildings, searching through rubble and wreckage while under constant sniper fire. They had found evidence of the convoy's destruction, including personal items and equipment scattered across a 3-block area, but no sign of survivors. Intelligence reports suggested that any Americans in the area had either been killed or captured by insurgent forces. The breakthrough came when the SEALs discovered drag marks in the dust near the ambush site. Someone had moved wounded personnel from the initial blast location, either insurgents collecting bodies or survivors seeking shelter. Following the barely visible trail through a maze of damaged buildings and debris piles, the team methodically checked every possible hiding place. Sarah first became aware of the SEALs' approach when she heard a sound that was different from the insurgent fighters who had been moving through the area. These footsteps were deliberate and disciplined, with the measured pace of professional soldiers conducting a tactical advance. Through her damaged radio, she had heard references to Trident operations, the code name for SEAL missions in the sector. The challenge was making contact without alerting nearby insurgents to her location. Sarah had observed enemy fighters establishing positions within 50 meters of the destroyed Humvee, and any noise might trigger a firefight that could get the rescue team killed. She waited until she could clearly identify American voices before attempting to signal her presence. Rodriguez spotted the overturned Humvee partially concealed beneath a collapsed concrete wall. The vehicle's camouflage pattern was barely visible under layers of dust and debris, explaining why previous search teams had missed it during aerial reconnaissance. He signaled his team to establish a security perimeter while he investigated the wreckage. The first indication of life came when Rodriguez noticed fresh blood drops leading away from the vehicle. Someone had been moving around the site recently, and the blood loss suggested serious injuries. He called softly in English, identifying himself as American military, and received a weak response from inside the twisted metal. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper when she confirmed her identity and status. She provided her unit designation, service number, and a brief report on her condition and the fate of her companions. Rodriguez immediately called for medical evacuation while his team prepared to extract her from the wreckage. The rescue presented significant tactical challenges. The overturned Humvee was wedged against a concrete wall in a position that provided excellent concealment, but made extraction extremely difficult. Sarah was trapped beneath heavy debris and twisted metal, too weak to move on her own, and any attempt to free her would create noise that might attract enemy attention. Sergeant First Class David Chen, the team's medic, squeezed through a gap in the wreckage to assess Sarah's condition. What he found shocked even a combat veteran who had treated casualties throughout 2 deployments in Iraq. Sarah had survived 15 separate gunshot wounds, along with shrapnel injuries, a broken arm, severe dehydration, and early signs of infection. Chen immediately began emergency medical treatment, establishing an intravenous line to address dehydration and administering antibiotics to combat infection. He cleaned and rebandaged the most serious wounds, while explaining to Sarah that extraction would require cutting through portions of the vehicle's armor plating. The SEAL team faced a critical decision. Using cutting torches or explosive charges to free Sarah would create significant noise and light that would almost certainly attract insurgent forces. However, leaving her in place while calling for additional resources might result in her death from blood loss and infection. Rodriguez made the command decision to proceed with immediate extraction, while 2 team members established overwatch positions to guard against enemy approach. The remaining SEALs began carefully cutting through the vehicle's twisted frame. They used small, quiet tools to avoid detection, working in shifts to maintain security while gradually opening access to Sarah's location. The process took nearly 3 hours, during which time insurgent patrols passed within meters of their position on multiple occasions. Sarah remained conscious throughout the extraction, providing intelligence about enemy movements she had observed and helping the SEALs plan their escape route back to friendly lines. The most dangerous moment came when a group of insurgent fighters decided to investigate the wrecked Humvee more thoroughly than their predecessors had. They approached the concealed vehicle with flashlights and tools, apparently planning to salvage equipment or search for intelligence materials that might have been overlooked. Rodriguez made the split-second decision to engage the insurgents before they could discover the rescue operation. The brief firefight lasted less than 30 seconds, but it alerted other enemy forces in the area to the SEALs' presence. Radio chatter in Arabic increased dramatically as insurgent commanders coordinated a response to trap the American Special Operations Team. With Sarah finally freed from the wreckage but still unable to walk, the SEALs faced the challenge of moving through hostile territory while carrying a seriously wounded casualty. Chen had stabilized her condition enough for transport, but she would require immediate surgical intervention to survive the journey back to friendly lines. The extraction became a running battle through the streets of Fallujah. The SEAL team moved through pre-planned routes, using their knowledge of the neighborhood's layout to avoid known enemy strongpoints, while calling for supporting fire from American artillery and helicopter gunships. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as the SEALs carried her through the urban warfare zone. She remembered the sound of explosions and automatic weapons fire, the steady reassurance of Rodriguez's voice, telling her they were taking her home, and the incredible physical strength of men who carried her for over 2 miles while fighting for their lives. The helicopter landing zone was a small courtyard that had been secured by Marine forces specifically for the medical evacuation. As the rescue helicopters approached under covering fire from Apache gunships, Sarah realized that dozens of American service members had risked their lives to save hers. The flight to the military hospital at Baghdad took 18 minutes, during which time Navy flight medics worked to stabilize Sarah's condition for surgery. She would later learn that she had technically died twice during the flight, requiring resuscitation procedures that kept her alive until she reached the operating room. Waking up in a hospital bed 3 days later, Sarah discovered that her survival had become national news. The story of the medic who survived 15 bullet wounds and 2 days behind enemy lines had captured public attention, but Sarah was more interested in learning about the SEALs who had saved her life. Rodriguez and his team had successfully completed their mission, but 2 SEALs had been wounded during the extraction firefight. They visited Sarah in the hospital before their own medical evacuation, and she was able to thank them personally for refusing to leave her behind. The bond formed between soldiers in combat transcends ordinary human relationships, and Sarah knew she owed her life to their courage and dedication. Recovery would take months of surgery and rehabilitation, followed by years of physical therapy and counseling to address the psychological trauma of her experience. Sarah eventually returned to civilian life, but she never forgot the lesson learned in Fallujah about the extraordinary lengths to which American service members will go to bring their comrades home. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell became part of military lore, taught in survival schools and used to illustrate the importance of never giving up hope. But for Sarah, the real story was about the Navy SEALs, who spent 2 days fighting through the most dangerous city in Iraq because they believed one American life was worth any risk. Years later, Sarah would return to military service as a trainer, teaching combat medicine and survival techniques to new generations of soldiers. She always ended her classes with the same message. In the darkest moments, when everything seems lost, remember that your fellow warriors will never stop looking for you. In Fallujah, that promise meant the difference between life and death.